Hi guys, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be learning about the human immune system. Okay, so first we're going to be looking at pathogens, what they are and what they do. Then we'll be looking at the two divisions of the immune system. We have the innate immune system and we also have the adaptive immune system. And then finally at the end we'll be looking at diseases of the immune system. Okay, so let's begin. So first we're going to be looking at the definition of a pathogen. What is a pathogen? So a pathogen is any microorganism. So it can be a bacteria, for example, or it can also be a virus, okay? What do they do? That can cause a disease, okay? So a pathogen is any microorganism that can cause diseases, okay? So here's an example. So for example, let's say this was a virus, okay? And this we call it. So once the virus infects this cell, we call this the host. So it's the host cell now, okay? Because the virus has infected it, okay? So once the virus attacks, we call this the infection. And then the cell that's infected, we call it the host cell. Now, of course, here comes the role of the immune system. So cells must have an ability to defend themselves. So the ability of the body to defend itself, to fight infection, what do we call it? It's known as immunity, okay? So that's when people say some people have stronger immunity than others. That means their ability to fight infections is stronger than other people, okay? And then now we look at diseases, okay? So we have two types of diseases, okay? We have transmissible diseases and non-transmissible diseases. So what's the difference between those two? So the main difference is transmissible diseases are caused by what? By pathogens, okay? So a pathogen causes what type of disease? Causes a transmissible disease. So what do we mean? We mean that they are contagious. So if I sit beside an infected person who has been infected by a certain pathogen, I could get infected just by sitting beside him, okay? However, non-transmissible diseases are not caused by pathogens, okay? They are caused by what? By unhealthy lifestyle, by genetics, and also environmental factors. So an example of an non-transmissible disease, we can say, example is diabetes, okay? Specifically type 2 diabetes. So type 2 diabetes is usually caused by what? It's caused by having an unhealthy lifestyle, and it also has a genetic related factor. And what does that mean? If I sit beside a person who is diabetic, I will not catch diabetes from him, okay? Why? Because it's a non-transmissible disease that is not caused by a pathogen, while transmissible diseases are caused by pathogens. And the reason is because those pathogens could be transmitted from one person to another, and now we'll be looking at the modes of transmission, okay? So we have two types of transmission. It can either be a direct transmission or it can be an indirect transmission. So the direct methods usually occur from infected individual to an uninfected individual. And this usually occurs by physical contact or by sexual contact, and it can also occur through blood transfusions, okay? This is where they are physically in contact. That's why we call it a direct method of transmission. While indirect methods of transmission can be ingesting contaminated food, okay? And now we'll look at it later on. Also ingesting contaminated water, even interacting with a vector organism. Now, what is a vector organism? So a vector organism is an organism that carries and transmits a pathogen, okay, from an infected organism. So from infected organism to another living organism, to a living organism. So you can think of it just as a mode of transport. So vector organisms are usually just modes of transport. They carry this pathogen and they transmit it from an infected organism to a living organism who is not infected, okay? And another can be also coming in contact with contaminated objects. So for example, if a person sneezes at a door handle and then I touch that door handle and then I touch maybe my nose, so that way the pathogens that have been released in the sneeze and I touch my nose, they can enter my nasal cavity and I can get infected, okay? And also another factor is air. So for example, if I sneeze in the air, that's transmitting pathogens. Maybe someone else enters the room and breathes in the air. The air could have airborne pathogens, and I could get, and the person who's in the room can also get infected. And all of those methods are indirect methods because they're not directly in contact with the infected individual like the first methods we talked about. So that's why this brings us to the question, how can we prevent the spread of such pathogens? So personal hygiene is one key. So for example, washing our hands before touching our eyes or our nose or our mouth, okay? Because those are ways that those pathogens can enter our body. It's also when we're coughing to cover our cough, or when we're sneezing to cover our sneeze, okay? So those are ways to prevent the spread of pathogens. Also, following hygienic methods of food preparation. So we said ingesting contaminated food can cause diseases. That's why if we look at dairy products, we usually store them in the fridge. Even meat, chicken, all in the freezer, okay? Because we don't want bacteria to grow. If we store them at room temperature, this is a suitable temperature for pathogens to grow and divide. And then if we ingest that, we could catch diseases, okay? And also while we cook, that's why we have to heat our food to kill any pathogens. That's why undercooked food can cause, for example, salmonella. Okay, salmonella, if we eat raw eggs, maybe for example, they're not cooked, it can contain salmonella and we can get infected, okay? And the same thing also for proper sewage treatment, okay? Because if our water, as we said here, if we ingest contaminated water, that could be from poor sewage treatment, we could catch, because Vibrio cholera grows in contaminated water. If we ingest that, we could get, remember we said cholera infects our intestines, okay? So that could also be a problem. That's why we need to have proper sewage treatment. And finally also proper management of landfills. Why? Because in landfills, pathogens are able to grow and replicate. So we don't want them to grow and replicate. That's why we have to have proper management of landfills, okay? Those are the ideas about transmissible diseases and non-transmissible, and the ways, the modes of transmission of pathogens, okay? Now let's look at the immune system. So what is the immune system? The components of the immune system consist of the thymus, spleen, lymph nodes, and also different white blood cells that are found in body fluids such as blood and lymph. And remember we said that the spleen and the lymph nodes are also part of the lymphatic system. That shows us that the lymphatic system also plays a role in what? So plays a role in fighting infections, right? So in protecting our body, okay? And that's also the main role of the immune system, is to protect us from pathogens. So we can split the immune system to two divisions. We can have the innate immune system and the adaptive immune system. Now, what are the main differences between the innate immune system and the adaptive immune system? So the innate immune system is usually a rapid response, okay, and it's non-specific. So it doesn't attack specific pathogens. It attacks all type of pathogens. While the adaptive response is usually more delayed, and we'll look at why it takes a bit more time to activate, and it also produces specific responses, okay? So specific responses against specific invaders. So we'll look more in detail, but the main idea is the innate is non-specific. It attacks all pathogens the same way, while adaptive, it has specific cells for specific pathogens, okay? So let us look first at the innate immune system. So if we want to think about it, let's say I have, for example, a castle, okay? Let's try to draw, this looks more like a cake, okay? But let's say this was the castle. Every castle is surrounded by a fortress, right? So for example, this is the walls surrounding this fortress. It prevents anyone from entry. It doesn't specify, it blocks entry to all types of invaders. So the same thing here. The innate immune system acts as this barrier, okay, that does not allow any pathogen to enter. That's why we said it is non-specific. So it uses natural barriers as its first line of defense. Those barriers can be split into two also. We can have mechanical barriers and we also can have chemical barriers. Now, what is the difference between those two? So, two examples of mechanical barriers are the skin and the nasal hairs that are found in our nose. Okay, so the skin. Why is the skin a good mechanical barrier? Because let's look at the composition of the skin. So the skin is made up of several layers. You don't have to know the names of those layers, but just know that the outermost layer of the skin is made up of dead cells containing keratin. So this is a tough structure. This provides a tough structure of the skin, preventing the entry of pathogens through our skin. Unless if we have a cut, now through this cut, pathogens are able to enter, okay? And also we have nasal hairs. What is their function? Is to trap pathogens, okay? So they trap pathogens. Now, if we look at the chemical barriers, we have mucus. Remember, mucus is secreted by goblet cells. We have mucus in our digestive tract, okay? We can also have mucus in our respiratory tract, right? So mucus is spread out throughout the body. So a lot of parts of our body secrete mucus. What does this mucus do? So mucus is a sticky substance, right? So this sticky substance, what does it do? It basically traps pathogens, okay? And then remember, if in the respiratory tract, this mucus traps the pathogens, and then we have the cilia, which are hair-like structures. What do? They flick this mucus containing the pathogens either outside our body, okay, or to digest it into the stomach, where they are killed by the stomach acid. So the stomach acid also is a chemical barrier. And remember, the acidity of the stomach is caused by what? So just a reminder, caused by HCl, which is hydrochloric acid. Okay? Even tears. So tears contain enzymes that also kill pathogens. And we also have secretions from the pancreas and the intestine. Those secretions also serve to kill pathogens. Okay? And we also have they secrete enzymes that kill pathogens, and we also have the passing of urine through the urinary tract, okay? So why is that? So urine is usually acidic, okay, so it has high acidity, and this high acidity doesn't allow pathogens to grow in the urinary tract, and when urine flushes through the urinary tract, it takes with it all the pathogens that are growing. So that in that way it acts as a chemical barrier preventing pathogens from growing, okay? So that's the first line of defense that acts in the innate immune system, which is the two natural barriers. We said we have a mechanical barriers and we have chemical barriers, okay? Now let's look at what if the pathogens pass through the natural barriers. What's gonna happen if they're able to pass through that? Okay, so our innate immune system will launch a non-specific attack. Remember, always, whenever we're talking about the innate immune system, we're talking about non-specific attacks, and this attack leads to usually inflammation in that area. So what happens? What happens in that process? Let's look at it. So we have damaged tissue. So for example, I got a cut and pathogens are able to enter. They pass through the natural barrier, which was my skin, okay? And they have caused damage in my tissues. So the damaged tissues will release chemicals, okay? Why will they release those chemicals? To announce to the body that I have been attacked, I need help, okay? So it releases those chemicals. Those chemicals, what do? They cause vasodilation of blood vessels and an increase in the permeability of the blood vessels. What will this lead to? This will lead to more blood flow, and also fluid will be able to leave. So what does this cause? So remember, vasodilation increased the smooth muscles relax, So there's an increased blood flow. This causes the redness. So symptoms of inflammation is redness, and this is caused by the increase of blood flow. Now, the increase of permeability leads to what? To swelling, okay? Because we have tissue fluid building up. This leads to swelling, and also the stimulation of the nerve endings causes what? Causes pain. So 3 symptoms of inflammation are redness, swelling, and pain, okay? Now, this blood that's flowing, remember we said blood carries white blood cells also. So those white blood cells will leave the blood capillaries and they're going to move into the damaged tissue. Now, what type of white blood cell is going to leave the blood capillary and enter the damaged tissue? It's going to be phagocytes. Now, what do phagocytes do? Remember, phagocytes are a type of white blood cell, and remember, they're acting in the innate immune system. That means they are non-specific. So their function is to engulf pathogens. Now, how do they do that? What's the process called? We call the process phagocytosis. So what happens? So for example, this is a phagocyte. Okay, those are pathogens. Okay, so look what the phagocyte does. It forms like a half a circle, not a fully closed circle, in order for it to be able to engulf these pathogens. Once it engulfs them, it's going to close up like you see in this picture. So it's going to put them in a sort of vesicle inside, and then it's going to release enzymes that are going to kill those pathogens. Okay, so remember, it's a non-specific process and it's rapid also. Okay, so phagocytes leave the blood capillaries, move into the damaged tissue. What do? They engulf the pathogens. What's the process called? We call the process phagocytosis. Okay, once it engulfs the pathogen, it releases enzymes that break down the pathogen. Okay? Now, at the same time, with the process of inflammation, we have the phagocytes performing phagocytosis, we have redness, swelling, and pain also. At the same time, what starts? So, for example, if we have a cut, this cut needs to be closed, right? Because I don't want more pathogens to enter through that cut. So blood clotting will be occurring. The reason is to prevent more entry of pathogens, right? We don't want more pathogens to enter through this cut. That's why we have blood clotting occurring at the same time. Now, another system that is also part of the innate immune system is called the complement system. Okay, it's a system that is made up of proteins. Now, what does this system do? Or when is this system activated first? Okay, this system is activated whenever we have a pathogen present. Okay, so whenever we have a pathogen present in our body, the complement system is activated, and the function of it is to fight off pathogens. How does it do that? By enhancing inflammation. So it supports the process of inflammation. That's how it helps fight those pathogens. Now, nothing is perfect. So our innate immune system tries to do the best it can to prevent pathogens from infecting our cells, and it tries, if they pass the barriers, it tries to kill them very rapidly, as we saw by phagocytosis. Now, it does not always work. So if the innate immune system fails, we have another system ready to act. What is this system? We have the adaptive immune system. As we mentioned, it is a specific system. We can also call it specific or acquired immune system. So it is specific against specific pathogens, okay? And it uses specialized white blood cells, not like phagocytes. Okay, phagocytes are not specialized. So here in the adaptive immune system, we use specialized white blood cells, and we call them lymphocytes. Now, lymphocytes can be split into 2 parts. Okay, they can be split into T lymphocytes and they can be split into B lymphocytes. But let's look now at T lymphocytes. So for example, we have a virus again, infects our host cell. So this is an infected cell now. So as we see from the infected cell, what do we have on the membrane? We have antigens. Okay, we have foreign antigens. Those are produced by the virus once it infects the cell. Okay, now those foreign antigens are what? They are protein markers that trigger immune responses. However, it's important to note that, for example, if I have a red blood cell, okay, remember we talked about red blood cells in our previous chapter. If I have a red blood cell, we said these red blood cells have antigens also. So if I have a antigen, okay, this blood group will belong to a blood group, correct? Now, will my immune system attack my own cells? Of course not. So those antigens, we call them self-antigens. Now, usually our immune system recognizes them as self-antigens and does not attack them. However, we have, and we'll be looking at later, diseases of the immune system where it's not able to know or separate between self-antigens and foreign antigens. And we'll be looking at that later on, okay? So usually, our immune system recognizes our self-antigens and does not attack them. It does not want to attack its own cells. However, once it recognizes foreign antigens, this triggers an immune response. Okay, and remember, those antigens are specific to the microorganism, so are specific to a virus, to a different type of virus, to a different type of bacteria. So they don't all have the same antigens. That's why we say that the adaptive immune system is specific to specific pathogens. Okay, so let's look at the T lymphocytes. So this is a drawing of a T cell. As you see here, we have receptors. Okay, we have receptors that recognize specific antigens. Okay, they do not recognize any type of antigen, they recognize specific types of antigens. So once this receptor recognizes this antigen, what's going to happen? This will become active. Once it becomes active, what will it do? It will start multiplying. Okay, so we need more T cells. So this T cell starts dividing, so we can have a huge number of T cells. And those T cells, what can they do? They can directly attack the pathogen, okay? Or they directly attack the infected cell. So what happens is that this T cell comes in contact with this infected cell. It's going to recognize its antigen. Once it recognizes its antigen, it's gonna become active. It's going to start dividing. Okay, so we have more T cells forming, and then those T cells, we can directly attack the infected cell and kill it. Okay, now at the same time, what do they produce? They produce something called memory T cells. Now from the name memory T cells, is for what reason they produce those memory T cells? Is if they encounter the same pathogen later on, we're going to have a faster response. Why? We're going to have a faster and stronger response. Why? Because our body already formed memory T cells that recognize this specific pathogen that we have been infected with it later on again in our life. Okay, so it doesn't have to divide as much. It already has memory T cells who, once they recognize this antigen, we can directly attack it. Okay, that's why we say that at a second exposure of a disease, we have a faster and a stronger response. Okay, that is for the T lymphocytes. Now, if we look at the B lymphocytes, they follow a slightly different mechanism. So what happens? So again, we have antigens, okay, foreign protein markers that are released by the pathogens, okay, or some pathogens already have them on their membrane. You don't need to get into the details. And then we have a B cell. Now, we have receptors also on this B cell that's going to recognize these antigens. Now, once it recognizes these antigens, what does it do? It becomes activated. Once it becomes activated, what type of cell does it become? It becomes an antibody-secreting plasma cell. Now, from the name antibody-secreting, so what's it going to secrete? It's going to secrete antibodies. Now, what are antibodies? Antibodies are Y-shaped, okay? You have to know they're Y-shaped proteins. They bind specifically to an antigen, so that means they are specific. So because they are specific, what do we expect? We expect the shapes to be complementary. So I expect, like here, I expect the shape of my antibody to be complementary to the shape of my antigen, okay? That's why we say they are specific. Now, those antibody-secreting plasma cells start secreting antibodies. Now, what happens once this antibody binds to an antigen? Okay, so look what happens. So we can have different scenarios. It can neutralize it. Okay, what do we mean by neutralizing it? It means it prevents it. So prevents it from infecting host tissue. That means that pathogen cannot do anything anymore. It doesn't have the ability to infect other tissues, okay? Now, what can it also do once the antibody binds to the antigen? It can signal phagocytes. So remember how we talked about phagocytes earlier? So once this antibody binds to the antigen, it puts like a certain marker, okay? This marker is recognized by phagocytes. It's like, for example, an alarm. So it binds to the antigen and then it sets like a marker. And who can read this marker? Phagocytes come to the scene and they engulf the pathogen, perform phagocytosis. And another thing that can also occur is it activates, once the antibody binds to the antigen, we have activates complement system. And what do you say about the complement system? It's a system made up of proteins that help fight against pathogens by enhancing inflammation. So we can see how the adaptive also relies, in a way, at the mechanisms that we saw in the innate immune system, okay? So we saw the phagocytes over there and we also saw the complement system over there. Now, what do we also have? We also have memory B cells. Now, what is the function of those memory B cells? Okay, is that if I get infected, so if I get infected by the same pathogen at a later time, I already have B cells that are going to secrete antibodies specific to this pathogen that I encountered the first time. That's why, again, always, second response is stronger and faster, okay? Because I don't have to form that many cells, because those cells already formed. They are my memory B cells. Once they encounter, they directly become active, and then they start secreting antibodies, and the same process occurs. Okay, so we talked about, let's just summarize a bit. We talked about the innate immune system. We said how we have uses natural barriers such as mechanical and chemical, and we spoke about the differences between those two barriers. And then we said if the pathogen manages to cross these barriers, what do we have? We launch a non-specific attack, and this leads to inflammation. We talked what happens during inflammation, and we also talked about the symptoms. So the symptoms of inflammation are redness. The reason is, we said, increased blood flow, swelling is because of the increase in permeability, and pain because there is stimulation of nerve endings. And we also talked about how phagocytes engulf pathogens by a process called phagocytosis. And we said that in parallel with inflammation, because if I have a cut, I don't want more pathogens to enter, so we have blood clotting occurring. And we also talk about the complement system, which supports which enhances inflammation, and this helps fight off pathogens. We also said that if the immune system fails, and sometimes it does, which is normal, That's why we have the adaptive immune system, where it usually uses specialized white blood cells. Those specialized white blood cells, we call them lymphocytes. And we said those lymphocytes can be split into two groups. We have T lymphocytes and we also have B lymphocytes. Now we looked at the T lymphocytes. They recognize the antigens by their receptors, and remember, they are specific. Once they recognize the antigen, they become active, they start multiplying, and they can directly attack the pathogen. We also start producing memory T cells that recognize this specific pathogen. Why? Because at a later time, if I get infected by the same pathogen, my body is able to launch a faster and a stronger response. And we also talked about B lymphocytes, where we have the B cell recognizes the antigens. It becomes an antibody secreting plasma cell. That means it secretes antibodies. Now, what are antibodies? We said they are Y-shaped proteins. They bind specifically to an antigen. So the shape of the antibody is going to be complementary to the antigen. Okay, and once the antigen binds to the antibody, it neutralizes the antigen. It prevents it from infecting host tissue. It also can signal phagocytes to come to the scene and perform phagocytosis, and it also activates the complement system. And we also said we have memory B cells that are produced. Why? Because if I get infected by the same pathogen again at a later time, my body can launch again a stronger and a faster response. Now, let's look at vaccination. You guys have heard of vaccination. Probably many of you have taken vaccination shots before. Okay, so what is vaccination? Vaccination is a process in which people are exposed to a vaccine, and now we'll be looking at what are vaccines made up of. So exposed to a vaccine that helps what develop immunity against a certain disease. So remember, vaccines do not cure diseases, they just prevent them from occurring. So they help us develop immunity against them. And vaccination is actually an example of active immunity. And then we'll be looking at the differences between active immunity here and passive immunity. But now let's focus first on vaccination. So an example of a vaccine that all of us have taken already is the COVID-19 vaccine. So this COVID-19 vaccine, they insert a vaccine in our body. Okay, this vaccine can be either a weakened or dead pathogen, or it can be antigens of the pathogens, but those antigens are usually altered a bit to prevent us from getting symptoms, okay, of the disease. So we can either, the vaccine can be made up of weakened or dead pathogen or antigens of the pathogen, and this helps us develop immunity. So we took the COVID-19 vaccine. It does not cure us. If I had COVID and I take the vaccine, it does not cure me from having COVID. It just prevents me from catching COVID again, because I build immunity against the disease. So what is the function of vaccines? Why do we take vaccines? One of the reasons is it enhances the development of memory cells. Now, how does it do that? So it does that by triggering an immune response. Okay? So how does it do that? So if I insert a weakened or dead pathogen or antigens of the pathogen, my immune response, my immune system will react to those antigens that have been inserted, or will react to the dead pathogen or weakened pathogen. Okay? So once I react with those, what am I going to do? My lymphocytes, which are my B cells and my T cells, are going to recognize them as foreign. So they recognize them as foreign molecules, okay? Once they recognize them as foreign, what do? They build memory cells against them, okay? The same process we talked about here and here, okay? The same process, that's how we build memory cells against them. That's why we say that vaccines or vaccination enhances the development of memory cells. Now, we also said it helps prevent diseases, but it does not cure them. And it also limits the spread of diseases. So an example is chickenpox. Chickenpox, we don't find it anymore. Why? Because everyone is vaccinated against chickenpox. So this does not allow it to spread between people, because people have a stronger immunity against it. They don't get infected by it anymore. So vaccines help the spread of diseases. Now we said vaccination, what does it do? Develops immunity. Now we have two examples of immunity. We can get something called active immunity and something called passive immunity. Now from the word active, so our body is playing a part in it. So what does it do? So the immune system actively produces antibodies that are specific to antigens, and it develops memory cells against it. So here, our personal immune system is actively working, is actively producing antibodies against the antigens and developing memory cells against them. So this type of immunity usually lasts many years, even a lifetime. So for example, we took the COVID vaccine, we didn't have to take it every month or every year. We took it once, or we took 2 doses, and that lasts us a lifetime, okay? Because our body actively produces such antibodies and memory cells. So an example is vaccination. Another example is infection. So once I get infected by disease, I'm performing the same process here. So my body is going to recognize the antigens of this pathogen, and it's going to trigger an immune response. Once I trigger an immune response, I will produce antibodies and memory cells against that specific pathogen, okay? While passive immunity, our personal immune system is not involved. So our immune system is not actively producing anything. That's why we call it passive immunity. So passive immunity is the transfer of antibodies from one individual to another, okay? So it's a transfer of antibodies from one individual to another. So my body is not producing any antibodies, it's getting them from a different person. Now it has some advantages. Some advantages: immediate immunity against a certain disease. So my body I don't have to wait for my body to produce antibodies against this disease, because sometimes it takes a bit of time. That's why we feel symptoms of a disease. Why do we feel symptoms of a disease? Because our body cannot directly produce T cells enough to kill the pathogen before getting symptoms, okay? So an advantage of passive immunity: our body does not wait to produce such antibodies, it gets them from a different individual. That's why we have an immediate immunity. However, it is temporary and it does not produce memory cells. So if I get infected by the same disease, my body will not launch a response like an active immunity. It will not last a lifetime, okay? Because I did not produce memory cells. I just got antibodies from a different person. So an example is injection of antibodies, or even breastfeeding. So usually children, while they're breastfeeding, in the milk there are antibodies, okay, that the child benefits from. However, they're not producing those antibodies. That's why it only lasts a short period of time. It's temporary, okay, but it's still important. Okay, now finally let's look at some diseases of the immune system. So a main disease of the immune system is the autoimmune disease. So remember how we said before that our body usually recognizes self-antigens and does not attack them. However, in autoimmune disease, our immune system falsely identifies self-antigens as foreign particles, and then it starts attacking them. So you can imagine how bad it is going to be if my body is going to start attacking its own cells. So examples of autoimmune diseases are, for example, type 1 diabetes. So how does type 1 diabetes occur? It's destruction of the beta cells. These beta cells, what do they produce? These produce insulin, okay? So my body starts attacking these beta cells that are found in the pancreas. So no more insulin is being produced. If no more insulin is being produced, my blood glucose level is going to remain high, and that will cause type 1 diabetes. Now, a treatment for that is what? Is injection of insulin. So I can inject insulin into my body in order to lower the blood glucose level. Okay, since my body cannot produce insulin, why is that? Because my immune system is attacking my beta cells, because it's falsely identifying them as foreign particles. So no more insulin can be produced by the pancreas. Now another disease is Hashimoto's thyroiditis. Okay, it's basically destruction of the thyroid gland again, because of the production of anti-thyroid antibodies. So these antibodies are going to attack my thyroid gland, and that's also going to be bad, okay? And we also have arthritis, which is where our body produces antibodies that affect the joints in our body, okay? This causes stiffness and pain in the joints of our body. It also has no cure, unfortunately. So such diseases are usually hard to treat because your body is basically attacking itself. So my body produces antibodies that is affecting the joints in my body, okay? So it is really bad. Now also we talked about asthma before. So asthma may include autoimmune mechanisms because there are some gene mutations that lead to a malfunction in the immune system, where it starts recognizing our cells as foreign and starts attacking them, okay? Now we also have another type of disease, which is immunodeficiency disorder. This happens when the immune system fails to launch an appropriate response, okay? So when our immune system is not working at its best, it cannot launch appropriate responses to pathogens, we are highly susceptible to infection, okay? Which is not good. Now those can be acquired in two ways. It can be acquired from a pathogen. An example is HIV virus. It's a virus, okay? Once if a person is infected by HIV, it will lead to AIDS, okay? This is where we have an immunodeficiency, okay? So our body is not able to fight infections well. So maybe a really simple infection can have a disastrous effect on someone who has AIDS, okay? Also, it can be caused by genetic mutations. If it's not caused by genetic mutations, it leads to a disease called SCID. Okay, this is even more severe than AIDS. So usually those people cannot come in contact with other people because any small disease that maybe our bodies has immunity against and are able to fight them easily, these people, okay, the ones who have AIDS or SCID, their immune system cannot launch an appropriate response, so they are highly susceptible to infection, and their immune system cannot help themselves, so they cannot fight these infections. That's why they're going to suffer from a lot of symptoms, and they could also have a huge chance to die from a simple disease that many people do not die from. Okay, that is what is known as immunodeficiency disorders. Okay, so just a quick summary of everything we took. So we learned about pathogens, what they do. There are any microorganism that can cause a disease. We learned about the two divisions of the immune system. We said the innate is specific, it's non-specific and is rapid, while the adaptive is specific and more delayed. Okay, and we also talked how it uses specialized white blood cells such as lymphocytes. And finally, we talked about the diseases of the immune system. Okay, we talked about autoimmune disease, and we also talked about immunodeficiency disorders. And that's it for today's video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you have any questions, let me know in the comments down below. And finally, at the end, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and don't forget to share it with your friends, and see you soon.